now we have this very frontal situation.
Hi, Bill.
Hello. Yeah, I don't know. If you guys want to start with something, or I have also some potential starting points for us, or whatever you think.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, I think a funny thing that in my conversations with both of these people, these wonderful people standing next to me, it's kind of interesting in relation to this question of shared experiences is sort of how we relate to the sort of disciplinary backgrounds that we come from. So I know in sort of a small conversation that we had recently, you were sort of describing your art historical interest in music as almost a kind of escape from certain aspects of the sort of formal discipline of art history. And I know, like in Volker's case, and it was just quite different, but Volker has just taken on this job running the sound studies department, but has written a wonderful text in the past few years, which is also very, I would say, very, very critical of the sort of mainstream of sound studies as it's kind of currently constituted in a sort of superficial way. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That's to maybe as a starting point in relation to thinking about shared experiences and communities around sound.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised that you are bringing up this issue of communities when we speak about pieces that are very private or even intimate. I mean, the idea is that in these pieces, a single person is transforming using software a certain sound file, and then is asked to perform certain actions in relation to this changed sound file. And these are one-person performances or one-person activities. And they are really not so much about groups.
No, they're not about groups at all. But I think in a funny way, they're about your, like I was in my funny little brief opening statement, they are, however, about things which one enjoys. And in a certain sense, I think that that's always sort of the presence of the group outside oneself, within oneself, in a certain sense. So I think that even though the pieces are very insistently for, in that sort of ideal sense, for a single person to do at home in their own setting, I think it's also meant as a sort of interruption into one's taste or one's preferences, which are always the sort of outside on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it still needs you, doesn't it? Because if I understood it correctly, if you want to download the software, you first have to contact you, no?
No,
No, you don't.
It's in the book. Yeah.
It's in the book?
Yeah.
So you can download it directly from the website?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing with these pieces that there's, I always feel sort of hesitant, is there are so many sort of mediating steps in these pieces, and the actual thing that one does in the end is maybe something very different than this kind of constant experience of sort of nested mediation. But yes, formally one would have to download something from this website. Then you have, like, the book is mainly these scores of 8 different pieces, and you put in whatever sound you want, it's changed, and then you can perform something with it. Like that.
But still, it's a lonely and isolated thing. And I don't know about your experiences, but when we did this exercise right now, I felt an interesting tension between my own experience and my own need to move closer or stay further away to follow your suggestions or instructions, and the feeling of my relationship to the group. I mean, there were people moving faster than I thought I would move, and then they were creating noise, so I actually had to move faster too because there were other people. But then there's also this feeling, well, do I hear not so precise than in comparison to other people? So this auditive aspect is something that tends to very much isolate me, maybe even more than with visual perception. That I'm just very much thrown back on my own perception and my own limitations. And this is something I felt being
It's
very
intimidating.
Intimidating.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's kind of forcing you into a place that you're not accustomed to, and you don't know how to perceive it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, but that's fine. That's good. I mean, I think that doing it with the group really, it's. I mean, by sort of default of like how to present these pieces in the world is sort of what happens often, practically. But really, in the way I thought of them when making them and doing them myself, sort of more spontaneously, they were really done alone. I mean, it's something very different. But at the same time, I don't know if I would say intimidating, but there is something funny about it because.
It's very personal.
Yeah, it's very personal, but it's like personal in the sense of it's asking you to do something weird with something very personal to you.
Yeah.
And that's a very sort of strange combination. I mean, in the interview with...
It's even showing something of yourself, you know? That's the intimidating part.
Yeah.
No? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. But
No?
But I guess the big difference to what we did just now and what we
we'll do...
should do is that
Right.
normally we picked a piece of music that we are very familiar with. But in
Right.
this case, I mean, we heard the text before, but it's not our text, it's a text you choose. But
Exactly.
in this case, it would be
I hope my comment didn't disorientate you.
No. It's a good point. It's like Fiona is saying. It's if you do it yourself with some source material that you have a personal relationship to, I think it's a very, very different kind of experience because the source material.
It's more about like interfering or how do you say that?
Defamiliarizing.
Yeah, and because you connect that to pleasure, no?
Mm.
And if I understood you correctly, and then I mean I never tried out any of these pieces, but I wonder if that's actually pleasure. But yeah, because some of them you mentioned that earlier, have a very strict like time schedule. Actually, for some of them you need a stopwatch, and then you have how would you describe it? It's very the movements are very strict, like for certain sides, and then you change direction or something like that. So
absolutely, but I mean that's I guess the question of them is what kind of pleasure they are, or if they are pleasurable. I mean, it's a silly example, but it's the example that I often give and which I mention, I think, in the book, which is when I sort of started to have the feeling that maybe these pieces can work, even though it's such a sort of unusual proposition, is doing it with my mother at my family home in Arizona. And my mother chose for her source material a song by Tori Amos. And what was interesting, and actually the piece that we did is one that I would like to do at the end tonight after we talk a little bit more, which is basically, well, I don't have to describe it now, but in the course of the piece, like you can still hear your song, you can still hear the source material, and you can still relate to it on the level of like, the melody and singing along. At the same time, in parallel, you're doing something very odd with it. You're moving in a sort of irrational way in relationship to it. So, while my mother was, for example, sort of dancing to her song and singing, she was also like walking out the door of our house and like walking all the way down the road in the middle of like the neighborhood where we live, walking to the highway. So, for me, that was kind of an interesting case to see where it can sort of work in a very.
But also the relation between like movement and listening, I think, or like the music and the concentration on your own movement. I think that's different in the single pieces, isn't it?
Yeah,
like sometimes
absolutely.
you have to concentrate more on the movement.
Exactly.
Sometimes more on
Exactly.
listening. I don't know.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it's about your own perception, and sometimes it's about the measurement of time or distance. And so, I think for somebody who's not used to perform, that's an extreme step to do, to not just follow instructions according to your perception or shaping your perception according to instructions, but actually following a watch and do certain activities that are measured in time. Are you a musician?
Not anymore.
So then, for you, it's also not such a big difference. I mean, you're used to the fact that somebody is telling you things in a time dimension.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I guess one should maybe say a few other things, like, I don't know, backing up, or I don't know. I mean, like, I was just speaking to someone beforehand, in a certain sense, the pieces like very much build on a very specific moment in sort of music or art history, which I would locate in like the late 50s, with the pieces of Cage that come after the silent piece, that for a brief period after he made his silent piece, he was trying to make these pieces which had no musical material, but were more like structures for doing anything in a way. They're very odd pieces, but I like them a lot. And they're sort of, for me, like, in his own way, which in a funny way has actually not so much to do with listening. They have to do with like how one can compose or how one can make work that is not oriented around some kind of material. So I guess one thing I meant to say also by saying that is that in a certain sense, I actually see these pieces very much as like musical compositions in an almost standard historical sense. And so, yes, absolutely, they have very precise indications at time, and you really need the stopwatch and such.
You also need some equipment for it.
Yeah.
And that's different to, for example, the Fluxus scores,
right.
Or for like event scores by George Brett or something where you just have a like piece of cardboard with a word or 3 words on it, like exit or
exactly.
I don't know what is what's that, ice or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually need a computer, you need speakers, you need internet access. So it's not completely free of
exactly. Yeah.
some kind of equipment.
And but for me that also means that or the funny thing about that, I think, is that in a sense the pieces really require sound in a way that some of the Fluxus pieces or sort of historical avant-garde pieces in the 20th century maybe didn't. Even if they're sort of facilitating movement, and movement is sort of the primary thing that you end up doing, the sound somehow is actually essential. And I think maybe sort of returning to this sort of first question about the group and the individual experience, maybe there's something about using the sort of perceptual aspect of sound as that is specifically the way to intervene into sort of this social personal dimension of like preference, of listening preference, of taste, is sort of confronting one's sort of given relationship with something one knows, a song, which is connected to other forms of sensation, and then sort of confronting that with something phenomenological in a different sense.
I was surprised. Well, you used the term exercise in the beginning,
yeah.
And in the book you speak of like how you can optimize the hearing experience,
yeah.
And like you say something. Speak about like the successful perform, well, even in quotation marks, but still. And I was quite surprised by that because Kirsten pointed that out in one of the essays on the Judson dance notation, that like Trisha found, for example, that what she found most interesting is like the failure factor, or what they found most interesting is the failure factor, and yeah, like the individual performance that actually turns into the dance in the end. And I was wondering what you thought about that, because as I said earlier, some of them are quite strict, and you really have to follow your rules, and there's not much. I don't know how much imagination is left.
Well, I mean, I think there is. That's the thing. Is I mean,
you mentioned your mother dancing.
yeah. But I mean, yeah. Okay, so that one with my mother is actually one of the much more open ones. It's very. It leaves a lot of space for contingency. But I think with the more strict ones, if you do really like practice them in a musical sense, and learn to do them, like sort of maybe even internalize the timings, which I'm sure no one has ever done, and who knows if anyone ever will. But if you did, there would be probably a similar undefined space or free space with those as well.
But would you say you actually have to perform them, or is it you can also like it's so it's no, I mean, like is it Lawrence Spina?
Yeah.
Where it's like you don't actually have to perform it, like, or you don't have to.
No, I very much
produce the piece. You can just imagine it.
I mean, I think what's interesting about the pieces is exactly what you probably can't imagine from reading the scores. Like that's why I was saying before that I always so like frustrated with myself about all these layers of mediation, because the experience you end up having in the end is one that involves all kinds of contingency and unexpected things that I would see as absolutely essential. I mean, it's a very, all of the pieces I think are also like very embodied experiences. They all, yeah, it's extremely different to just talk about them as we're doing now, or to look at the book and just read it, and to actually do any of them. And for me, the pieces don't really happen until you're doing them.
I mean, one piece, for example, deals with a speaker set up in the middle of the room, and you are supposed to walk or to actually run around the speakers in a circle. And the piece requires you to do this in different speeds. And I did this in a public setting at 7 hours here in Berlin. And one speed was quite challenging for a slow, not so sportive person like me. And you become actually dizzy. And so this whole notion of moving, breathing, sweating, getting dizzy, of course shapes your auditive experience. So in a way, you are not just giving me instructions what to do, but also how to change my state of being in a very bodily, very basic way, which really changes the way I experience the sound. And this is something I find really interesting. So that you're getting rid of the notion of the audience, and you're somehow combining the perceiver and the performer. So in terms of traditional music thinking, this already is quite a statement in itself. But then you shape the listening experience by making us move in a certain way. And another thing about these codes, I mean, these software applications we need to actually change the original sound file. I think these are one of the most important reasons why these pieces don't work as conceptual pieces just imagined, because Bill is quite secretive about these algorithms. I mean, they are roughly explained in the book, but from a musicological point of view, they are actually part of the score, but they are not really easily accessible. They are not described in a way that somebody else could program them in a different language or a different machine or something. So, I don't know, do you think about these algorithms as instruments? Like something that's kind of fixed and not on the performer's disposal?
I'm not sure about instruments, but yeah, in that direction, yes. I mean, of course, in order to make the algorithms, Scott Cazan, somebody in LA, programmed them for the book. All of that data to the millisecond is there. There are Excel tables that describe all of the sort of temporal structures of each of the pieces or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that I would want to print in the book necessarily, not because I don't want to hide it, but because I think they're just lists of numbers. I mean, it would be of a musicological interest for someone, but not necessarily for the interest of someone performing the pieces. I mean, I don't know if if it just confuses things more, but I guess I can just also say about the specific algorithms that sort of drive the pieces. They're also the only moment in the pieces that are very sort of explicitly, or not really, I mean, in some sense explicitly referential. For example, there's a piece that is a little bit like sort of what we did at the beginning, that involves within one room walking back and forth in relation to a speaker, and the timing of walking back and forth, and also the rate of change in the loudness, to be very technical, is actually derived from a song, which is from this movie Che cosa sono le nuvole of Pasolini from the 70s, a short film. And it's the song of the garbage man as he's taking these puppets to the garbage can. And all of the pieces in their sort of deep structure, so to speak, have some kind of, for me, important referential element.
Quite a few of them refer to film, no?
Yeah, that's true.
You have one with a dolly zoom, yeah.
Right.
So.
These seem to be all very much sense perceptions, but not emotional perceptions.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
like kind of sensory a view of things, but is there emotion involved at all?
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I think the basis again of like if you're using your
Sensory is great. I love it.
No,
you
no,
know,
but-
I just love like the light coming into my body. You know, but does it bring the motion somewhere?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, when you take your own material for it and you use your own song or whatever, there is a sort of maybe given emotional response which you already have with whatever that material is, your sort of personal investment in that material. And then what the piece does is sort of reorient you in relationship to that. And in that sense, something happens, something is changed, and you then respond to that however you do. It's not something I determine or want to determine or try to determine. So I don't know. It just depends on how personal your relationship is to the source material.
It's like a spirituality or something, you know. Like
not from my side, but that sort of indeterminate moment at the end, where sort of what the change to the material means to you is not something I can determine, and that's important for me not to determine.
And who would care about emotions anyway in this context?
Oh.
well, we're human.
Yeah, but I mean, he is not interested in communicating emotions. I mean, there are situations, and of course the perceiver is free to react in a personal, emotional way, but I mean, the emotions are by no means part of the piece.
I mean, yeah.
Wow.
I don't
It's
know.
disappointing.
Oh no, it's liberating.
Oh, perhaps. Have you been in love?
I don't know. I mean, there's, like...
That's really cut and dry. That's like hardcore, like the borderline.
Like the...
I'm sorry, we're human beings.
This, for example, like this song that I mentioned before, the Pasolini song,
Yeah.
has, for example, a particular funny emotional resonance, perhaps when you hear it as a song. And what remains of that in the piece is a particular rhythm and a particular speed of change. And whether those abstracted relationships still offer you some kind of contribute to some kind of like deep semiotic form of emotion.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Mhm.
But I don't know. That's
Maybe we can ask you about this notion of pleasure you're referring to in the texts.
in what sense?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, okay, I don't know. What's interesting to me is that the pieces be fun, that they be pleasurable, but that it's not a form of pleasure that we necessarily, or maybe I just say it even if it's not entirely true, that it's not a form of pleasure that we know. That's not a form of pleasure that, for me, is tied potentially to other things which might be in different ways somehow problematic. It's a sort of pleasure of giving oneself over to something sort of indeterminate, but something particular, not just any indeterminacy, very specific, particular indeterminacies.
But it's associated with following instructions, to your mind?
Orders.
Uh-huh.
I would say that's not the main thing, no. That is, of course, a part of it. I mean, there's a piece in the book, it's actually the piece that involves running around the chair, but like the little image that I chose, sort of in a tongue-in-cheek way, is a like super silly looking like S&M chair device. And obviously that sort of, I'm aware of those kind of suggestions of in the score relationship, but I don't think that's, for me, it's not like the primary site of aesthetic experience, which I would put rather in the experience of actually doing the piece and what happens for you while you're doing it.
I mean, those connotations are interesting, but that's not what I meant. I think I was more referring to the idea that we talked about scores that might not necessarily need to be performed, and you, with these pieces, have an interest in them actually being performed.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to me to think about pieces where the instruction part, once you're in the piece, is clear. It's relatively clear. You do this and this and this, whatever. This is your interpretation based on these instructions. But the decision is the part where you sort of overstep any kind of clear rule, like you decide to perform this piece. That's a different thing. With you, that's not the focal point. For you, it seems like performing the piece and going through the instructions is the pleasure part. But the secondary decision is still, I think, at least in this tonight, this performance where you have a communal situation, it kind of comes back up because there is no clear instruction that I should have, for example, taken part in the group experience. It's more of a principle, like we should do it if we want to test out the piece and get to the point of following instructions. But it seems to me like that's kind of a soft rule, and I don't know how that plays into the rest of your scores or the body of work that you're working with.
I can just add something to it, because I find it interesting that you use different terms throughout the book. Like you say it's a song, it's like one time you say it's an exercise, you say it's an instruction, you say it's a choreography. So you leave it, like in the end you leave it pretty open what it actually is.
Yeah.
Or at least you use all these different terms. And you don't stick to the term score or notation. So.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's what I was sort of trying to a little bit vaguely say, is that what interests me most is the sort of combination of something quite specific, but something which is very contingent that comes out at the end. I don't know. I mean, I think that the moment that you point to, Gary, is very important, the moment to sort of decide to do these things. And I guess I let it sort of often be soft, so to speak, when I'm in these situations, because I don't think it really helps in a situation like this to insist fanatically on the letter of the law, so to speak. But at the same time, if one really seriously wants to do the pieces, one does have to follow the letter of the law, so to speak. In the same sense, only to the degree that realizing, a Beethoven sonata, one would have to do something similar.
But there you're already dealing with the tradition and the practice, if you will. And here, as a listener, as a performer listener, suddenly need to develop a different relationship to the everyday stereo equipment I'm using at home and the architectural setting I'm using it at home. So it's actually, unless you're starting a trend, I mean, it's really fresh and new. So it's not so much, I mean, I think it's hard to compare to the Beethoven, except that there are certain rules to follow. But even when you say that the performance can be an interpretation, I think this is very much to ask for, because it's, I guess everybody doing these pieces is so much struggling with actually doing them in a way that they can be considered done or realized. That this notion of interpretation, where I can actually develop a perspective on the piece, is really hard to reach.
Absolutely. But
or is this also some sort of, ironic?
No, I don't think it's ironic at all. And in a certain sense, it's maybe an extremely funny or naive thing to say, but in a certain sense, I think in some kind of weird fantasy space, I do imagine them as another form, as something, sort of different cultural activity. Like Henry Flint has this funny, in his concept art text from 1960, I forget exactly how he puts it, but he says something about how it's maybe not relevant to talk about those pieces as art, that they're simply, or entertainment, and now they're sort of an independent other cultural activity. And in the sort of most maybe grandiose sense, I think I actually do sort of think of them this way. And so that even though that horizon of likeliness, that anyone actually do that, is extremely remote, obviously I'm very aware of that, that would be the correct way, so to speak.
So it's also about failing?
I mean, only from, I think, someone else's, from a meta perspective. I think what the pieces offer is really what they offer. They're not meant, like, ironically, in the sense that of a failure. They are doable. One can do them. If one actually spends time doing this strange activity and rehearsing this sort of useless, strange thing, they do improve, and the aesthetic experience is better, I think, personally. And perhaps then there is a space for interpretation, so to speak. So, yes, of course, I understand that aspect of failure is kind of interesting when it's confronted with the world, but that's not like why I do the pieces.
Maybe I'm just forgetting that there's no audience. I mean,
It's religious.
And so, yeah, do you think of them in terms of rituals?
No.
It's spiritual.
No, I think of them as a sort of different way of relating to one's everyday life. And in that sense, I know I have mentioned this too, there's this wonderful book, which I'm sure is somewhere in this room, this Christina Kier book about Russian constructivism, and about like this kind of brief moment in the 1920s in Russia where all the sort of avant-garde artists, or not all, but a lot of them in Russia, started to make everyday objects, to make like cups and tables, and Tatlin made an oven and this kind of things. And there was this sort of like gung-ho attitude of remaking the everyday in the sort of so-called post-socialist moment or post-revolutionary moment as like a legitimate continuation of these avant-garde artists' project. And that for me was extremely inspiring, this idea. And I think the crux of that issue in her book also, which returns to this question of pleasure, is the crux of the issue is trying to imagine another form of desire in relation to the world. And in the context of this book, obviously because it's the Soviet Union, she's talking about that the sort of primary relation of desire in the world is that of like the commodity and sort of commodity fetishism and that sort of that whole thing. And so that like the challenge and maybe also the super failure of this constructivist work was to try to create a different basic form of relation to the world.
But in this case, you have to prepare. Like you can't just have it. You have to decide. Like now, I'm gonna have this experience.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's strange. Yeah, I don't know.
Question: do you know the hearing pieces of Rory Schaefer, the Canadian soundscape guy?
Yeah.
And he has a bunch of educational pieces like for school children. They're
Right.
awesome, right?
Yeah. Those are great.
And they kind of remind me of this, but they're these are quite different. But
No, but
there's a similarity, right?
there is, and those are real interesting. And I guess like the difference is just that like these are really specific. I mean, those are maybe his pieces are maybe more related to some of the Fluxus things or the early '60s things, and they're sort of open-ended, and they really are like educational things. You can do a workshop, and in this case, these are sort of like pieces.
So it's more like David Dunn's Peaceful Listener.
It is, yeah. That's one of the only ones that I think is like a really direct relation in a sense. Is David Dunn's this piece, Purposeful Listening in Complex States of Time, or something like this, which is incredibly difficult, like almost like really 1,000 times more difficult than this. That has no material, and it's a piece that however, sort of notates all other parameters of listening, like which direction you're facing, whether you're like kneeling or up, and which angle your head is at, and all of these kind of things. And they're sort of, yeah.
And even if the sound is in the future or the past.
Right, about like sort of your subjective relationship to what you're hearing, like whether it's, yeah. No, that's a wonderful piece. It's a strange piece though, because it's like, we had him at Bard a few summers ago, and it's a piece that has almost no reception, I think. It's a piece that he made. It was not made for any particular context, and it's just sort of there.
But like yours, it's
It's
like it's also a format for writing. I mean, the essay at the front of it seems like it's kind of a statement
of course.
itself. And
Yeah.
I don't know if there's no reception. I think it's kind of isn't it kind of like a classic? It's like getting to be. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm hanging around with the wrong people, but it's kind of a.
Well, yeah, sure. For like an extremely small niche audience, I'm sure it's.
But what kind of audience could there be besides that? I mean, if there's no audience except for performers, ever,
I don't know.
we're gonna watch people listening.
It's information. It's accessible. It's there,
But yeah,
available.
But are these pieces are just made for one person, or also for groups?
There are some, like the ones in the book they were all made originally for one person. In the last few years, I have been doing group-based pieces. There are some sort of smaller group-based pieces. There's a piece for two people in apartments, which are right next to each other, and it involves sort of passing sound through the wall, back and forth, according to the rhythms of this scene in Genet's Chant d'Amour film, where they're blowing smoke through the wall. No, but then in the last few years, I did some really pretty big projects, 2 parts in these Corbusier apartment buildings in Berlin and in Marseille, which, in a certain like formal sense, are kind of the same. Like they're based on softwares that can take on any material, and Christian, who's there, helps realize these. But in those cases, they're about really like coordinating, for example, an entire floor of an apartment building where you have 60 apartments, and coordinating people's home stereo systems so that the sound moves literally from apartment to apartment and up and down the hallways and things like that.
So you mentioned the essay, like the beginning of the book, but I think the instructions or scores, tutorial diversions, I mean, they read like small essays as well, because they're so packed with references to not just films, but also other composers' works. And you mentioned that, well, there's one that refers to spirituality, I guess, like which has a again like a rotating, or what do you call that, movement, and to dance. So I think I wonder why you decided to actually make a book out of it, if you can see them online. So and because then obviously like the language dimension itself becomes more present, or you read it more properly, I guess, and the references, at least I was.
Sure. I mean, I think in a way, just for making the book was also just a way for myself to sort of get over these pieces, because they're sort of, in a way, they were a big turning point for me, and I've been doing work in this direction for, I would say, like 10 years or so, and I just sort of wanted to have them as an object so that I can just give them to other people and have them available. I mean, exactly. I was thinking, so what I wanted to do, a few things. I mean, one is I would like to sort of stop, when we stop, to do one of the pieces finally together, which will involve going outside. And I don't know, but maybe before we do that, since it involves going outside, before we do that, it might be better to talk a little bit more, especially if you all have thoughts or comments more.
Martinez.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have just a question in relation to the comment that was made on emotion, and I would just want to try to kind of get more to the point and ask, isn't that the point of getting rid of emotion in this classic of your piece, in a way, in the sense of getting rid of this classical romanticist paradigm where we have like Beethoven or Tchaikovsky suffering and then kind of transmitting to us this experience through music. But then, I mean, to get rid of this notion that is still bound on this person-to-person relationship, that still binds you on this kind of receptive setup and on this hierarchy. So, like, getting rid of emotion in that way, I think it's like, would you say that it's the point of your work?
It's like part of it. It's part of it. I mean, it's not that I have necessarily this antipathy to that kind of reception. But yeah, I mean, what the pieces do get away from that, they do totally break from that. But in a much more open-ended way, in the sense that if one is going to spend all this time practicing these pieces and becoming an interpreter and spending all this time, perhaps one develops a new kind of investment in these pieces, and that does not exclude any form of affect or emotion. And I wouldn't want to do that at all. It's not so, which is also to say, I guess, that I'm not in any sense, whatever this would even mean, I don't think it's a really even meaningful thing to think necessarily opposed to emotion. Yeah, of course, but rather to the specific sort of coding of certain emotions with certain materials. That a formula, like a sort of automatic form of reception where you hear, you know, a minor chord and it's sad, and a major chord and it's happy. Yeah. Yes, please.
I was wondering how the work means something different in the art world versus the music world.
Yeah, it's a very good question.
I mean, for you, I guess.
I'm not entirely sure how to answer. I mean, it's, in a certain sort of almost of necessity kind of way, these things are presented probably as much or more in an art context than in a music context, just because it's sort of as like refugees or something, that they're sort of, maybe the art world is more apt to present such a thing. It's not necessarily my desire that it be associated necessarily with the art world. In a certain sense, I really do see them as music pieces, but there are almost no music contexts where it's sort of thinkable to present them. But I'm not sure if that's really that interesting.
Are they meant to be presented? Sorry. Are they meant to be presented? I mean, I think it's a classical form of house music. This is just something you do at your piano at home before the invention of radio. And
yeah, but at the same...
there is a long important tradition of music that's not public.
Absolutely, and that interests me a ton. I guess the thing is that because they are sort of unusual as themselves, there is some moment that requires mediation or explanation. If I just said, okay, these pieces are just to be done at home in their ideal form, I think there would be... no one would ever do them, in a sense. I don't know, it's...
I'm maybe that's
but
my...
then you have the spectator factor, no? If you do it.
Of course. No, it's in a certain sense it's very wrong to do them as a group. But
yeah.
The one that we will do soon is the one that works best with a group, but yeah. But it seems to me like a sort of compromise that seems necessary for their existence at all.
Yeah, but you could have faked like the classical piano album.
Well, that's what this is, sort of. It's,
yeah. No, but you present this in an art bookstore.
Yeah.
Well, there's a music section.
Yeah. I know. I'm very familiar with this. Yeah.
No, I don't know if it's, it's a discussion which is interesting, but it's also, I wish I could connect it in a more interesting way with the rest of the discussion. I don't know. I mean, yes, one can complain about music's disciplinarity all night long, and that's something I did for many years. I mean, when I was, before I was doing these pieces after I went to school, I did a whole series of pieces that had more to do with like the aspects of presenting music itself than sound itself, and in the concert situation. So I did like a ton of pieces that had to do with like applause and bowing and all of the sort of framing elements of classical music, which are in a sort of shocking way totally invisible, I think, in the consciousness of most contemporary musicians. Or with Ensemble Zwischentöne in 2009, I did a whole series that was sort of dedicated to looking at the history of music presentation, and really like also very directly with this idea of house music. We did house concerts at the home of Erika Hoffmann down the road that really involved background music in part and this kind of salon setting. So I mean, it's something I'm extremely aware of, but something which in a funny way these pieces sort of, for me, were also a way out of this constant fighting with the discipline.
What would you think of a recording of a performance of one of these pieces, like with binaural microphones?
I think it's super uninteresting. And the other thing is like, these pieces are like super uninteresting to watch or listen to. Like if I were to like perform one for you, I mean,
We included images.
yeah, but it's more, but that's more like how to. The images are thought of as like, like how to, or I was thinking of like these Alan Capro. He has these later pieces which also involve. They're also photos of people like showing how you do these things. Yeah, but you don't have there. I mean, sure, you can watch it that way. I can walk in a weird way in front of you while there's a sound playing, and maybe that is sort of in some weird sense interesting. But I think that it's a much more complicated, interesting experience if you're the one walking.
No, but I meant like with binaural microphones, for example, somebody performing. I don't know exactly how the pieces are, but
Yeah.
I imagine one with very big changes between both ears or something. Would that make any
But the
sense?
whole piece is about the interplay between the sound and your physical movement and your location in space. And this is something that's just not represented in a purely auditive medium. You know, the sweating and the running, and I mean, this is just...
Yeah, we should do one while we talk about it forever. It will take me a minute. Just this has been recording, and I thought, like, since our so-called shared experiences of obviously this sort of self-reflexively of our talking, yeah, I've been recording it, and we'll use that as the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to just prepare it quickly, and I think Fiona will actually read briefly the instruction of what we're just going to do. The red one, yeah. Yeah.
Realization of 3-part